Well, here we are. It's Wednesday, June 28th, 2023. I'm Larissa, and I am here at one of Gallery Studio, and I am reading my newest novel, When It Becomes Too Much. Today we'll be reading chapters 5 and 6. This is a work of fiction, purely a work of fiction, and I wrote it. Chapter 5, a lot of questions. In the car, Ruth held Patty's salad in her lap. She didn't mind. She was just glad to be going home. Brian had quickly finished his big greasy after Ruth said she was ready to go. There was something like fear rising in Brian about Ruth. He wasn't sure what it was, but Ruth was different. Brian drove silently, and Ruth just looked out the window. Brian didn't even bother to pick up a mixtape. It wasn't far back to Ruth's townhouse anyway. When they pulled up to the curb in front of Ruth's townhouse, the two cops from the day before were standing at Ruth's door knocking. "Do you want me to come in?" Brian asked as Ruth reached for the door handle to get out. "If you want, but it's okay. They told me they would probably be back today," Ruth said, opening the door. She looked over her shoulder and smiled at Brian as she sat Patty's salad on the seat where she had been sitting. "Tell Patty I say hi, and when you get home, text me. I'll let you know if there's any trouble. If I don't text back, assume there's trouble and come back if you can," Ruth told Brian. "Okay, how about this? I take my mom her salad and just come on back." Ruth was relieved. "Okay, if you don't mind, that would be great." Ruth closed the car door and Brian pulled back out into the street. As she turned toward her home, the two officers were now facing her. "I thought we told you to stick around," Officer Linda said. Ruth couldn't tell if she was joking or not. "I just went to Steamers with my friend," Ruth said, a bit annoyed. "It's not like it's that far. You could walk there if you really wanted." "You're fine," Officer Dan smiled. Ruth relaxed some. "Can we go inside?" he asked Ruth. Ruth fished in her giant bag for her keys. She found them finally and pulled them out. Yeah, come on in." Ruth opened the front door, allowing the two officers to enter before her. She dropped her bag in her grandma's rocking chair and sat on the couch. The two cops remained standing. "Can I use your restroom?" Officer Linda said. "Yeah, there's a half bath just beyond the kitchen back there next to the pantry." Ruth nodded with her head towards the kitchen, and Officer Linda moved in that direction. Dan had his little notepad out again and was smiling. He was kind of handsome. Ruth felt herself blushing. Color rose in Dan's cheeks and ears, too. He laughed nervously, breaking the awkward silence. "So, we were able to see the ATM camera footage from yesterday," he said. "That's good. So, you see, I never even talked to him." "Yeah, we saw it. You came home around 1:15, and then around 2:15 a van stops. You came home around 1:15, and then around 2:45 a van stops in front of your townhouse. It parks for a while, and then when it leaves, the homeless man is there. It looks like he was dead when they left him. He never moved from the face-down position until my partner touched him." Dan's face had become serious now, and Linda rejoined them in the living room, wiping her hands lightly on her thighs. Ruth was relieved and a little upset at the same time. "So someone just left the guy there like that? Do you know how he died?" Ruth asked. "Well, it looks like a probable overdose, but we don't know for sure yet. This is probably going to be on the news later tonight. You don't need to answer any media questions." Linda extended a business card with a phone number underlined in red as Dan continued. "You can tell anyone looking for information to call the number on this card. If anyone bothers you too much, you can also call the number and let us know. Sometimes these cases get a little weird." Ruth took the card and looked at the number without really seeing it. Officer Dan's words were rolling around in her ears. "Do you think someone left him in the front of my house on purpose?" Ruth looked up at Linda and Dan. "Well, that's something we wanted to ask you. Is there any reason why someone might do something like that?" Dan asked gently. Ruth's eyes got wide as she thought about it. "The attack happened 10 years ago. I had never seen the guy before, and I haven't seen him since, but lots of folks know about it, and yesterday I quit my job. They tried to get me to come back," Ruth offered. "What do you mean they tried to get you to come back?" Linda asked. "Well, Tom, that was my manager's manager. He called me yesterday after I left work to tell me I could come in this morning and accept my promotion, and we could pretend yesterday didn't happen." Ruth didn't think anyone at the office would have anything to do with this, but lots of homeless people in the area knew about Ruth's attack, and a couple even teased her from time to time when she was out walking in the neighborhood. Ruth explained this to Dan and Linda. Dan nodded. "We will keep our ears open, but it's most probable your house was chosen randomly as a place to dump him," Dan said, making a few notes on his pad. "Do you know his name?" Ruth asked. He had an expired driver's license from Nevada on him. The photo looked like him, 40 pounds heavier and healthier. It was probably him or maybe a family member. It said his name was Gregory Stephen Morris. He was 38 years old. We were trying to find next of kin to give us a positive ID. Please don't share this with anyone yet. We don't publicly release the name until a family member has offered positive ID. Ruth shook her head in understanding. Greg Morris, she said out loud. Yeah, why? I just feel like I should know the name of anyone who is left dead on my doorstep, I guess. Ruth shrugged. There was a knock on the door. Are you expecting anyone? Linda asked, walking towards the door. Yeah, my friend Brian, who I just had breakfast with, was taking his mom her lunch and then coming back over here. He's my best friend. The one they wanted me to fire at the office, Ruth said. Oh, okay, I'll get the door, Linda. Linda went to get the door, and Ruth could hear Brian. Why isn't Ruth answering her own door? Where's Ruth? Brian was demanding. She's right here, Linda was saying. Come in and see. Linda moved aside to let Brian enter the living room, where he saw Ruth was just fine, seated on her sleeper sofa. She was still paying off. He rushed over to her dramatically. Oh, Ruthie, are you okay? Brian made a show of sitting down beside Ruth and hugging her. Well, I think we have everything we need, Dan said, rolling his eyes at Brian's over-emoting. Remember, you are not obligated to talk to the media, and you can give anyone who pushes that number we gave you, and let us know if anyone bothers you too much, Linda finished. The media? What number? Brian asked Ruth. She will tell you about it. We will see ourselves out, Dan said. Thank you, Ruth. You're welcome, thank you, Ruth said as Linda closed the door. Brian was beside himself. Tell me everything, he demanded. There's not much to tell. There's a camera at the ATM across the street. They saw me come home, and like an hour later, a van pulled up, and when the van pulled away, the guy was next to my stoop. They said he was probably dead when he was dumped. Oh my God, Ruth. He was already dead? Do they know who he is? Kind of, but they're trying to find a family member to make a positive ID before they release his name. Well, no wonder you smoked all those cigarettes. You must be so stressed right now, Brian said compassionately to his friend. Sitting there in her red and white sundress and golden toes, she looked fragile, and Brian didn't want her to break. Hey, that boy cop was kind of cute. Did you see a ring? Brian smiled at Ruth, who was blushing now. I wasn't looking. I wouldn't know, Ruth answered. She hated talking about men with Brian. He called them all boys, and it made Ruth feel like a pedophile. Besides, she wasn't interested in dating anyone, and Dan had no reason to be interested in Ruth. My mom might be blind, but I'm not, girl. That guy was cute, and he was smiling at you. It must be the gold toes. Brian smiled a sideways smile at Ruth, who was continuing to blush and wanted to change the conversation desperately. So did you call Sydney yet? Ruth changed the subject abruptly. Brian's entire facade changed from mischievous imp to outraged gay man. No, and I don't want to call her, but I brought her number with me. You call her. Brian pulled the crumpled paper with Sydney's number scrawled in Patty's blind hand out of his pocket and waved it at Ruth. Me? Call her? I've never even met her once, Brian. I'm not calling her. You call her. You can use my phone. I'll be right here. You call and find out what she wants. None of us are 13 anymore. People grow up sometimes, Brian. Call her. Ruth pointed at her landline phone on the island. Brian shrugged and walked towards the phone. He leaned against the island and flattened out the piece of paper against the faux marble. He picked up the receiver and pressed the buttons. It's ringing, he said, covering the mouthpiece. Brian brought the phone with him and sat next to Ruth on the couch. It rang 5 times. Brian was about to hang up when Sydney answered. Ruth could kind of hear a high-pitched girly girl-sounding voice. Hi, Sydney, it's Brian, your cousin, Brian said. Ruth couldn't hear exactly what Sydney was saying, just the tone of her voice. Yeah, my mom told me you called the other day. I'm sorry to hear your dad isn't well. Oh, wow, that is fast. Brian's face got a strange glazed look as he continued to talk to Sydney. It was the same look he used to get talking to Debbie on the phone. Sydney, that is very generous, but... Sydney interrupted Brian, and Ruth could hear her already high-pitched voice getting higher. Well, I'd have to talk to my mom. Oh, and I have a friend who might be interested too. Brian looked at Ruth, shaking his head excitedly up and down. I'll talk to them both, and I'll come over tomorrow. Yeah, I have the address at home. I'm looking forward to seeing you too. Ruth could hear Sydney say something else before Brian smiled and hung up the phone. You're looking forward to seeing her too? Who were you talking to? Ruth asked, confused. Brian was smiling sheepishly. Maybe you're right. Maybe people do grow up, Ruth. Why? What did she say? And why might I be interested? You're scheming something, Bri. I see the look on your face. No, it's not a scheme. It just makes sense, and it has come at just the right time. Brian was nearly pleading. Ruth was suspicious, but listened as he went on. Sydney's dad is dying and has moved into hospice. The house is huge, and Sydney's dad suggested she call me and my mom and see if we'd be interested in moving in. There's a handicap-equipped ground-floor apartment on one side my mom could live in, and the rest of the house is 8 bedrooms and 10 baths. We could each have our own floor, Ruth. Ruth scowled a bit now. This sounded too good. Yeah, but how much? Ruth said softly. That's the best thing, Ruth. Nothing, nada, zilch. We just all have to pitch in when things need fixed. The house is all paid for, and the taxes are next to nothing because my Uncle Melvin inherited it from my dad's parents. Sydney said she has no problem paying it, and it's a fraction of what the rent was on her old apartment in Mountain View. She just needs help taking care of the house and grounds. She's already on the deed with her dad since her mom passed, so it's hers free and clear when he dies soon. It's on 10 acres with a pool and a tennis court, so you want to go with me tomorrow or what? Brian was really excited now. Ruth was still skeptical. I'll go with you tomorrow to keep you from making any crazy mistakes. What's her dad dying of? And I thought you said you hadn't seen her since you were 13, Ruth prodded. Brain cancer. It's inoperable. He's been living with it for the past 8 years. She said she is tired of watching her dad suffer and that everyone, him included, is ready for him to pass. Could be any time now, she said, like literally right now. And yeah, I haven't seen her since my dad's funeral, but I've talked to her a couple times, and she wrote me some letters a couple years back. I just didn't mention them to you. I remember the house from when my grandparents were still living. It's amazing. They ran an inn of sorts after all their kids moved out. My dad had 10 siblings. Melvin is the last one living. That's why he got the house. Ruth was still skeptical, but the idea was intriguing, and she had no idea how she was going to make her next rent payment in 2 weeks. She'd been living hand to mouth for the past 3 years since her LeBaron needed a new transmission and her old couch was ruined when the upstairs plumbing broke around the same time. She had one more payment to make on the sleeper sofa, coffee table, and end tables. She should have gotten something from IKEA. That would have been more in her budget, but Brian had encouraged her to splurge on something better, made with character, that she would have longer. You're sure she said no rent? Yes. She said we could live there for free. Me too. You were family, but I've never even met her. You too. My mother mentions you in our Christmas card to the family. She talks about you like we're a couple. Sydney knows who you are. Brian rolled his eyes when he mentioned his mom. Oh, I didn't know she did that. Now I'm embarrassed. What does she tell people about me? Oh, nothing. Just stuff like Brian and Ruth went to Santa Barbara to Antique, or Brian and Ruth got me a new dishwasher for Christmas, stuff like that. Nothing big. Oh, well, that's okay, I guess. Really, Ruth, what on earth would my mom have to tell anyone about you? That you got your toes painted gold for once? That you make the best potato salad? I'm going to go home and talk to my mom about all this. You want to come with me? Brian was picking up his bag. No, I think I just want to hang around here. I need to do some laundry, and I was thinking I might put some color on my hair. Brian was shocked. Ruth had always objected to coloring her hair before when he brought it up. Well, I should probably talk to her about it alone first anyway. She's never liked my Uncle Melvin. I'll come pick you up tomorrow at 10, and we can go to Steamers again, and then go meet Sydney, and she said to come around 2-ish. Okay. That sounds like a plan to me, Ruth said as Brian was standing in the front door looking back at her in her red and white sundress sitting on the couch. Ooh, this is going to be so good, Ruth. I can feel it. Brian turned and closed the door and left to go home and talk to his blind mother, just like Ruth. She was going to have a lot of questions. Chapter 6, A Lot of Reasons. Brian's head was swimming. He couldn't believe the luck of the timing. The lease on their apartment was up the end of the next month, and the stairs, as few as they were getting difficult for Patty to navigate. Grandma and Grandpa Strodman had moved from Hawaii to the mainland after Pearl Harbor. Grandpa hadn't been able to join the military because he was missing 3 toes from a shark attack when he was a kid. Grandpa Strodman had 45 acres in Hawaii. After the bombing, he had sold the property easily to the U.S. military, and they had used the overly modest sum from the Hawaiian sale to have the enormous house built in Santa Clara County, bordering Santa Cruz County. The house was worth millions now. Sydney said she only paid property tax on $125,000 and some change. It really was ridiculous. The land in Hawaii was probably now worth at least 4 times as much as the house in Santa Clara. He hoped things were still in good shape. When Brian walked in the door, his mother was sulking in her recliner with Melba in her lap. Is that my butt-fucking son? Is Ruth with you? Patty said. Her almost empty salad container was on the dining table. If I'm honest, I can't even remember clearly the last time I kissed anyone, let alone engaged in butt-fuckery, Mom. Really now, the priest down the street gets more action than me, and no, Ruth isn't with me. She said she wasn't planning on seeing you today and wanted to stay home. Brian slung his bag on the back of his chair at the dining table and went in the kitchen. He came out with 2 bottles of Crystal Light. He shook them and put one in his mother's hand before he sat down on the couch. Didn't plan on seeing me. Well, what the hell does that mean? Patty worked the lid off the bottle and took a drink at the same time as Brian. Brian swallowed hard. I don't know. You'll have to ask her next time you see her. Ruth's getting weird, Mom. Something changed in her the other day. She's a different person. Brian pouted. Patty laughed. What do you mean? A different person than you? Yes, Brian. Ruth is not an extension of your ego. It's about time you noticed. She's around the same age as you. The 2 of you spend almost every day together. Neither of you are married or have children. Her clock is probably ticking like a bomb in her ears, Bry Guy, and you're just too deaf to hear anything. Patty took a long drink, draining half her bottle of pink liquid. Brian was angry again, but he didn't want to fight at the moment. I'm sure Ruth is not pining to marry me, Brian said curtly to Patty, but save it for another day. I have something I need to talk about with you. With moi? Patty made an exaggerated gesture, pointing at herself. Yes, you. I called Sydney back. Oh, how nice. I know you've had your differences, Brian, but Sydney's a grown-up now, just like you. Wouldn't you like to have some extended family in your life, even if it is your father's family? Patty was pleased with herself. Brian rolled his eyes. Yeah, I know. But I'm so glad you feel that way. Melvin is ready to kick the bucket any minute, and Sydney said she finally put him in hospice the other day. The house is in her name, and Melvin suggested she ask me, you, and Ruth to come live with her at the house. The master apartment has been made ADA compliant since Melvin got sick. Sydney had it cleaned. She said you could live in it, and me and Ruth could have our own floors. Sydney said she's been living on the top floor since she moved back home to take care of Melvin. She said we could live there rent-free, just help take care of things when they come up and help care for the grounds. Mom, it's perfect. Ruth and I are going to see her tomorrow. Brian was almost foaming at the mouth, thinking about the swimming pool. Patty had her eyebrows raised over her glassy-looking eyes. What? Brian asked her defensively. What? I'll tell you what. What the hell place of it is of Ruth to have a floor in your grandparents' house if you aren't her husband? And why would I take charity from Melvin? Patty spat. Everyone in the family knows who Ruth is, Mom. You talk about her like she's your daughter or something. Why wouldn't Sydney offer Ruth a floor? And it's not charity from Melvin, Mom. It's just good common sense. He's the last of Dad's siblings, and Sydney is the only cousin, other than me, that still lives in the state. The rest of the cousins moved back to Hawaii a long time ago, and Aunt Stella died last March. Aunt Stella had been the wife of Brian's father's oldest brother, Jacob. Brian never knew Jacob. He had died before Brian was born. Aunt Stella was nearly 100 when she died. Sydney wasn't at the funeral. She was out of the country on an extended vacation at the time and didn't bother to come back. She and Stella had never been close anyway. Patty pursed her lips in the direction of where Brian was standing. It was childish, but he was sticking his tongue out at his mother. She couldn't see it anyway, and it brought him at least a small amount of satisfaction while having this frustrating conversation with the belligerent woman. Okay, Bry Guy. You and Ruth go over there tomorrow and check things out. If it's as good as it sounds, I will think about it. But you just remember what you were saying about Sydney the other day and how sneaky Melvin's been over the years. Brain cancer or no brain cancer. Brian wasn't sure how Melvin had been sneaky, but he sure had listened to his mother call Melvin sneaky his entire life. Uncle Melvin was always nice to Brian. He thought maybe he should go see his uncle. It could be the last time he got to see him, and if they were going to live in the house, Ruth would want to see the man's face at least once before he died. I know, Mom, was all Brian said, and went back to his room. Laying on his bed, he could hear Patty turn on the TV. She flipped through a few channels until she came across some cable channel playing Jeopardy reruns. Brian closed his eyes and placed his hands on his stomach and willed the big greasy to digest. Back at her townhouse, Ruth was walking from room to room. Her townhouse was 3 levels. The bottom floor was the living room, kitchen, dining area, and a half bath. The second floor was her bedroom, a small office, and her full bath with a dressing room and closet. The top floor was like a finished attic. Ruth had it set up as a combination workout and sewing room. She hadn't been to the top floor in over a year. She lost her interest in sewing, and working out in the top room was often too hot. She and Brian power walked at lunch sometimes and wore small weights on their wrists and ankles. Ruth opened the door to the top floor room and was struck by the musty smell of a room that's been sealed for too long. There was a half-finished quilt project on her sewing table. Her resistance bands were hanging on the wall where she left them. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Ruth ran her finger through the dust and rubbed it. It was dry but a little sticky. There had been a lot of pollen so far this year. Ruth opened the blinds of the window behind her sewing table and the room filled with natural light. The old quilt project sent a pang through Ruth, and her conversation with Brian about his fight with Patty came to mind. The quilt was supposed to have been for a young woman at the office who had announced she was pregnant. Debbie, of course, had to throw her an office baby shower. 2 weeks before the party was supposed to happen, the young woman had a miscarriage. It was awful. The poor thing cried every time she saw Debbie. Ruth stopped working on the quilt and locked up the room. The baby print fabrics now made Ruth terribly sad, and she was surprised. Ruth left the blinds open and left the room, closing the door behind her before heading down the stairs to her bedroom. Looking around, she saw she didn't have much furniture, really, just the bed, nightstand, one dresser, and a chair by the window. Her stuff in the dressing room and closet was organized in built-in shelves and drawers. She didn't have a whole lot, and the only really heavy thing was the sleeper sofa downstairs. Brian better help her move that. The only reason she bought a sleeper sofa was because Brian said he was tired of couch surfing and wanted a proper bed for when he had to stay over. Her full-size bed was hardly even half the weight of the sleeper sofa. She could carry her mattress all by herself. Ruth wondered how furnished the house was they were going to see. She wasn't sure how she felt about just moving in and taking over where someone left off living. She would take all of her belongings with her if they were going to really do this. Ruth was looking forward to meeting Sydney. She couldn't be as bad as Brian had always made her out to be. Ruth walked into her bathroom and flipped the light switch. There was mold in the corner of a shower. She just couldn't get to go away. It would be nice to not look at it anymore. If this worked out tomorrow, it really was going to be a godsend for Ruth. Other than the $839 in her checking account, she had no cash on hand, and 2 of her 3 credit cards were maxed. The other one had a 0 balance, but it was only supposed to be for emergencies. She was going to have to use it to pay minimum balance on the other 2 cards so she could pay the car insurance and renter's insurance plus her groceries. Even if she qualified for unemployment, things were going to be really tight for a while, at least until she found another job. The more she looked around her apartment, the more she realized she needed tomorrow to work out with Sydney. Ruth finally made it down to her living room. She could smell the ashtray in the dishwasher. Ruth decided she needed another pack of cigarettes and to run the dishwasher. She added the soap and turned on the machine, then grabbed her bag from the rocking chair and headed out the front door to the corner store at the end of the block. Her toes sparkled in the sunshine. At the corner store, Ruth had to wait in line. It was hard because the 2 guys ahead of her were talking about Gregory, only they didn't know his name. They just called him the dead guy. Ruth kept quiet and pretended she couldn't hear the men. One guy said he knew the dead guy. He said he lived under the overpass a few blocks away and had shared a pizza with him last week. The other guy called him a liar. Both were purchasing 40-ounce bottles of malt liquor. Ruth wished she wasn't dressed so brightly. She wanted to just melt into the wall and disappear listening to these guys talk. When they both finally left, Ruth was the only customer in the store with the attendant. She put her credit card on the counter and asked for a pack of Camel Light 100s. "Lady, we have Camels and Camel Lights," he told Ruth. "Lights, then," Ruth said. As he ran her credit card, she saw the business card the cops had given her with a number. She took a chance and got the attendant's attention. "Hey, I saw the dead guy," she said. "Oh, yeah? You saw this supposed dead guy?" To the attendant's credit, you never could tell if the homeless were crazy, lucid, or just pulling your leg most of the time. For all he knew, no one was dead. "Yeah, he was right next to my front porch. I saw him. I'm the one who called the cops," Ruth said. Now the attendant was looking at her with interest. "Dude, was he, like, all rotted and shit?" "No," Ruth said. "He was just dead. The cops gave me a number to tell people to call if they knew anything or had questions. I can give it to you." "Sure, yeah, I'll take that number." The attendant smiled, revealing he was missing half the teeth on the top of his mouth. Ruth held the card up to the bulletproof glass so the attendant would have a good view. "See the number underlined in red? Copy that down. That's the number to call." The attendant scribbled the number down and taped it to the top of the register. "Thanks. Hey, don't forget your cigarettes." He pushed the cigarettes almost off the counter. Ruth grabbed them and smiled weakly. "Thanks," she said, and started walking back towards home, not sure she had done the right thing giving the number to the corner store attendant. As Ruth approached her townhouse, she saw the 2 guys from the corner store in front of her stoop, behaving in a very animated way. Both had their .40 in a brown bag in one hand and were gesticulating with the other. The closer she got, their conversation began to waft on the breeze towards her in her red and white sundress. He was right there. "Whatever, man, you probably left him there, then went and sucked his mom's dick. Say that again, man, and I'll, you'll what? The older-looking of the 2 men was stepping toward the other one aggressively, and Ruth was going to have to brush past them to get in the front door. She decided to just keep walking. Suddenly, she remembered telling Brian she was going to color her hair. There was a drugstore the next block over. She could go pick up something, and hopefully the guys would be gone when she got back. Ruth took her time and decided to light a cigarette as she walked. The smoke filled her lungs in a comforting whirl. She immediately felt invisible, like no one could see her. It was just what she wanted, no one to be able to see her. She stomped out her butt as she approached the drugstore and walked in, still feeling invisible. Invisibly, she floated towards the hair care aisle. Invisibly, she picked up a box of hair color that promised to cover all her grays. Ruth had mousy brown hair with lots of white ones. She chose a strawberry blonde color, hoping it would just tint the white ones and not totally change the color of her hair. Ruth stood in line, paid the cashier, and walked out the door, still feeling invisible. Walking out of the store, the sunlight on her bare face made her feel visible again. She immediately needed some security and dug in her giant bag for her cigarettes. She found them and lit one, and the smoke did its trick, granting Ruth the invisibility she craved. Her comfort only lasted until she got within eyesight of her front stoop. Both guys were still there. One was lying on the sidewalk, about where Gregory Stephen Morris lay dead the other day. The other one was spitting blood on the sidewalk and waving his hands above his head as he walked in a circle, every now and then yelling down at the guy on the ground, who wasn't moving. Both 40-ounce bottles were on the ground now. Ruth stopped and pressed herself up against the building next to her and dug in her bag for her cell phone and that business card. As she dug in her bag, she held her cigarette between her lips, smoke swirling up towards her eyes. Just as she spotted the business card, a chunk of ash fell in the bag. Oh well. Ruth desperately dialed the number and listened for the ring. It didn't even ring once before someone picked up on the other end. "This is Officer Dan Michaels." "Hi, Officer Dan, it's Ruth," Ruth said, half breathless from the camel and half breathless from anxiety over what was happening in front of her house. "What's wrong?" Dan asked. Ruth explained about the two men, about seeing them at the corner store, then in front of her house, and now. "Stay where you are. Someone will be there soon," Dan instructed Ruth. "Okay, there's a bench. It's a bus stop, I think. It's covered. I'll just sit down," Ruth said. "Okay, don't approach them. We're on our way." Ruth hung up and lit another cigarette off the end of the one she was just finishing. She sat on the bench. There was vomit in the back corner, and it smelled, but as long as she kept her cigarette close to her face, she couldn't smell it so much. So at least the cigarettes were good for something. Even Brian would have to admit the smoke smelled better than vomit. Ruth smoked 4 cigarettes before a cop car finally showed up in front of her townhouse. It wasn't Dan and Linda. It was two medium-height male officers. One approached the guy walking in circles. The other went over to the one still on the ground. Ruth watched as the one walking in circles was put in handcuffs, and the other officer prodded the guy on the sidewalk with his foot. He rolled over and shielded his face. Ruth couldn't hear what was being said, but the other man was now getting up, and the other officer was putting him in cuffs as well. She decided it was safe to start walking back towards her townhouse. As Ruth approached with her keys out, one officer was tucking the 2 drunk homeless men in the back of the cruiser. The other one was walking towards her stoop. He met her just as she reached the bottom of her short 5 stairs. "Do you live here?" "Yes," Ruth answered and mounted the stairs. "Did you call this in?" "Yes," Ruth whispered. She didn't want the 2 men in the car to hear. "Okay, are you safe? Do you need anything else?" the young man asked. "No, just so long as they're gone. One of them said he knew the guy who died. I heard him say it twice," Ruth offered. "Which one said he knew him?" "I don't know. I was trying to not make eye contact or look at them and draw their attention." "I see. Well, at least we know one of them said he knows him. Thank you." Ruth had her keys in the door and was trying to get away from the scene on the street. She just wanted to make another pot of coffee and smoke a few more cigarettes and dye her hair. She pushed the door open and almost fell over the threshold trying to get away. "Thank you," the cop was saying to her again as she closed the door and gathered herself. Then she ran up the stairs to her bedroom suite, tore off the dress, and wrapped herself in her plush fluffy robe and slippers. In her robe and slippers, she applied the dye, then went downstairs and put on another pot of coffee. The dishwasher was done running now. She fished her favorite mug and the ashtray from the top shelf, and when the pot was ready, she drank the entire pot and smoked 10 more cigarettes. While she smoked, she made a list of the pros and cons of moving in with Sydney. If she moved again, this time she wouldn't bother sending the new contact information to her family. This thought pleased Ruth in a deep, satisfying way. She was looking forward to tomorrow for a lot of reasons. Ruth and Brian and Ruth. Oh my goodness. What will happen next?